What's up, everybody? This is Vincent Tung, the Wandering Warrior. Now, I know most of you guys know me as a Kung Fu guy or Shuai Jiao Shou, a wrestler, the guy that goes to Mongolia and Inner Mongolia to wrestle, no weight classes, and pit myself against the best, right? That's all true. That is me. But there's also the me that's an avid archer. There's also the me that is really into harness and eskrima. And there's also the me that is really passionate about the indigenous hunter-warrior martial cultures as well. See, I moved to Taiwan years ago to learn Shuai Jiao the Taiwanese way, as well as deepen my understanding and ability in the Chinese martial arts, especially Chinese weapons and traditional Chinese boxing, and to immerse myself in the indigenous culture of Taiwan. And then since I've been back in the USA, I've been pondering life here in America. See, I was born and raised here in Massachusetts. One of the 50 states of the USA, the United States of America. And as a kid, I was deeply passionate about Native American history, cultures, and of course, their warriorship, right? It all started when I was little, and I asked my Mom, why is this place called Massachusetts? And she said, I think it's some kind of tribe that lives here or used to live here. And I said, well, what happened? In the past, Algonquin peoples, Massachusetts were one of them, set up their towns and villages for their tribes and nations all up and down the East Coast, right? From Newfoundland, what is now Newfoundland, up in the north, all the way down to what is today South Carolina. So this is quite an expansive ethno-linguistic family of indigenous America. So it was obvious to me as a kid that there were once these people, but now it's mostly white people. What happened? Now, if you know a little bit of history, you know the answer, but let's not look at this as noble savages doomed to genocide. I'm not coming at this from the angle of fatalism or inevitability. I want to look at this from the standpoint of human agency, courage, and martial arts. Now, obviously, I'm not Native American myself, and I know that there's a lot of knowledge lost. And there's also a lot of knowledge that's kept within the tribes and nations and meant for their people and not outsiders. I get it. I respect it. Yet at the same time, I believe there's a lot that I can comment on and I can share. And so with that in mind, I want to speak on the spirit, the ethos, the history, the culture, and the fighting skills of the Eastern Woodlands Native warriors. Now, on the eve of European colonization, in the Eastern Woodlands, that is east of the Mississippi River of North America, many Native peoples engaged in frequent, albeit lower intensity warfare. They were in a state of near constant warfare, and it could involve most of the adult male population in terms of combat, and as far as the targets or victim of this violence, it could be anybody. Generally, they didn't wage war to conquer land or for strict profit. Rather, it was for revenge, prestige, capturing captives, and a term we call mourning, right? Not good morning, but rather someone died. So when someone dies, we mourn their passing, right? Their death leaves a painful vacancy in our hearts, in our families, in our communities. That's when someone dies. When someone's killed, we're mourning, but someone's got to pay. Death required vengeance, and obviously killing would lead to more killing and feuds. Native warriors would gain prestige, status, and the respect of their peers by being good at exacting revenge upon their enemies, and of course, taking captives. Now, women and children that were taken captive would usually be adopted into the tribe. However, enemy warriors that were taken captive, not so lucky. Typically, they were ritually tortured and then sometimes cannibalized. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat this stuff. Warfare is quite savage. Whether it's very interpersonally savage, like in this example, or it's, you believe in God the wrong way, I'm just going to kill you all. That's also quite scary, right? These are just different kinds of scary. We're all human. There was also quite a culture of stoicism, and warriors were expected to endure these tortures with as much stoicism as they could. Obviously, they didn't call it stoicism, but you get what I mean. War helped the community to conclude their period of mourning the death of one of their own, and to restore the morale and that spiritual strength of their tribe. With killing resulting in more killing, necessitating more killing, revenge, and so on and so forth, you can see how warfare was kept on a quite frequent basis. But at the same time, because they weren't fighting wars of conquest, mobilizing all of their population, they're living on a farming, hunting, gathering basis, it's a lower intensity yet very frequent form of combat. So the Mourning Wars helped decrease the enemy populations, taking women and children captive, increased your population, it increased your status and prestige and the respect that you were able to earn, right, as a warrior, and it helped boost the spiritual strength and end the period of mourning for your community. Now, Eastern Woodlands, most of these people socioeconomically were hunting, gathering, and farming. For the most part, it was not huge monocultural establishments. These were towns and villages farming just enough that they have some surplus for the winter and maybe a little bit additional to trade. So far to the northeast, a lot of these peoples weren't so sedentary. They were semi-nomadic or seasonally moving to different areas, and they weren't able to grow a lot of crops. Once you get to lower New England and further south, you have people that could live more sedentary lives, growing crops, preparing for the winter, and so on and so forth. So some of them would actually grow a surplus to trade with those who didn't have any, and of course, store some for winter. Also, a big part of their lives was devoted to hunting, and that would be the foundation of their martial arts. So in the old days, those ancient spears and dart throwers were used, but those were gradually supplanted by the bow and arrow. By the time the Europeans had arrived, Native Americans were already very skilled in archery. And archery was the preferred skill set in combat. Now, the bows are normally what we call self bows. So they're made out of one piece of wood. That bow stave is made out of a piece of wood, right? It's not composite. And they would take off that bark and it would work a green. That means freshly cut, rather than drying it for a long time. I suspect that has to do with the fact they used to be using stone tools. So it was easier to work a green. They would chase that bark, they would chase that ring, tree rings, chase that ring all the way down so you have a consistent ring. Therefore, you have a stable structure. Flip it around, you tiller the belly, right, of the bow till you get that desired shape. And sometimes it's sort of like a D cross section, or it's like a flat rectangular cross section. Sometimes there's a bit of a narrower part for the handle and then wider limbs, depending on the style of bow. But by and large, they were self bows, not usually reflexed, and they were usually between 30 to 50 pounds. Sometimes higher, sometimes you get 60, 70, but typically 30, 40, 50 pound bows. And just as in hunting, they vied to get close enough to take a nice, clean, accurate shot, right? And their arrows were also typically like made out of reed or made out of cane or certain types of wood, tipped with flint or bone and fletched in a particular way. Bi-fletched, that means it's two fletchings, but there are characteristic methods of the Eastern Woodlands that you might not find in other parts of the world like Europe, Asia, or Africa. Not only did they vie to get close and take, clean, accurate shots from behind cover, they also prized being able to shoot rapidly. Right? Sometimes you're on the run. And so there's actually this myth about the legendary Hiawatha, who united the 5 Iroquois nations, the Haudenosaunee. And it is said that he could shoot 10 arrows into the air before the first one fell down. So speed shooting. That was an important skill in specific situations. Maybe you were on the run. Maybe you had a bunch of people you were trying to get, right? So that's another really cool skill that they worked on. Again, the foundation here is hunting. It's a hunter-warrior complex. Just as with hunting, war had its seasons. And just as with hunting, the element of surprise is crucial. So raiding parties usually took the warpath in the warmer months, right? When there's a lot more greenery and foliage so that you could sneak up on your enemies better. They would form one large battle group going into enemy territory, and then upon entering enemy territory, they would split up into smaller groups. And these groups would disperse and try to ambush people while they were out fishing, hunting, farming, whatever it may be, or form a raiding party. And so the ideal victory was one where they could take captives, kill enemies, and get out with none of their guys getting killed. 0 casualties was the best way. So keeping that hunter mentality in mind, go in, get the meat, get out, right? They usually avoided risky attacks on large columns of enemy warriors, on well-fortified villages and towns. Risking their lives like that wasn't worth it based on their reasons for combat. So as you can imagine, they preferred and got excellent at hit and run attacks. And the war leaders would muster the warriors together before invading enemy territory and lay out an overall strategy. But aside from that, there usually was not a clear chain of command, and definitely not any kind of authoritarian command structure. Once the strategy was laid out and the warriors dispersed, that was it. He had no more control over them. In fact, control was really not what he was about. The war leader, the war chief, was respected for his war wisdom, for his personal fighting ability, and his willingness to distribute the loot. Now, this form of warfare was very frustrating for the early European colonists because they were used to pitched battles, volley fire with muskets or arquebus. They were not used to this hit and run style of warfare, constantly harrying and ambushing and skirmishing. So for them, it seemed almost cowardly, but it was very hard for them to deal with, especially initially where they weren't used to the land nor the tactics and the martial arts being employed. The native warriors, following their hunter-warrior doctrine, would just launch guerrilla-style hit-and-run attacks on them, taking accurate shots from behind cover and refusing to fight them in the open. And it took a lot of time, a lot of bloody fights, and the assistance of native guides and allies for the Europeans to start picking this stuff up. By the time we get into the 1700s and the American Revolution, we start seeing white frontiersmen with their long rifles being able to fight in a very similar fashion. John Eliot, a colonist of the time, says, "In our first war with the Indians, God pleased to show us the vanity of our military skills in managing our arms after the European mode. Now we are glad to learn the skulking way of war." Skulking as in skulking is sneaking through the forest, hunting down your enemies. In addition to hunting, the many peoples of the eastern woodlands had accompanying spiritual practices for war. They also had stickball, which is similar to today's lacrosse, but rougher, bloodier, and it toughened up the young men, allowed them to blow off steam, work as a team. They also had wrestling, of course, and war clubs. These could be root burrow clubs, spikes. They could be ball head clubs like this, also typically made from the root of a tree. They also had atasa war clubs, which are sword-like clubs, almost like falchions. And there were also clubs that were sticks with spikes on them, so it's basically a war pick, as well as stone, and later, of course, through trade, steel, tomahawks. Preferred target was typically the head, to smash the brains, secondarily maybe the clavicle, right, to snap it and disable people, and oftentimes there were a lot of wounds on the left forearm as people tried to go into wrestle or grapple or just instinctively try to save themselves. As one Englishman, John White, wrote down from 1587, "But whilst one of these savages traitorously embraced one of our men, the other, with his sword of wood, which he had secretly hidden under his mantle, struck him on the head and slew him." Now, I did say generally native warriors did not besiege fortified villages and towns. I mean, these could have large palisade walls, watchtowers, and everything. So the casualties were not usually worth it. However, sometimes they did. And so if they did, they would approach with mantlets and shields made out of wood, with armor made out of wood and string holding it together. You have breastplates, helmets, and a whole back piece. Now the back piece is interesting because it's not to protect your back when you turn around against the enemy. You've got hundreds of warriors behind you shooting arrows. It's actually protect you from getting shot from behind. There's going to be arrows flying all over the place. So with this kind of protection in the front ranks, These warriors would place wood against the palisades, light a fire, threatening to burn down the place. And that would cause the defenders to have to come out to fight them off and put out the fire. Sometimes this took on almost ritualistic aspects where warriors would call one another out in duel and perform feats of martial prowess and skill. Once the attacking group felt like they had enough kills and captives, they usually left. Because number one, they don't want to sustain a lot of casualties in order to get their kills and captives. And two, the longer you besiege that town, the more likely that tribe's allies are going to start coming together and wiping you out. So you got to get out of there before they bring more numbers to bear. At times, Native American warriors of the eastern woodlands would actually amass for pitched battles. It wasn't common, but it did happen. And when it happened, they would usually engage first with archery and insults, trying to rile up the other side. And once they're out of arrows, they would clash and use grappling and warclubs, sometimes spears, but mostly hand weapons, percussive hand weapons, to finish the job. John Smith, yep, that John Smith, described a battle between the Monacans and the Powhatans. These enemies took their stands a musket shot one from another, ranked themselves 15 abreast, and each ranked from another 4 or 5 yards, not in file, but in the opening betwixt their files, so as the rear could shoot their arrows as conveniently as the front. They approached in their orders, on each flank a sergeant, and in the rear an officer, for a lieutenant, all duly keeping their orders, yet leaping and singing after their accustomed tune, which they only used in wars. Upon the first flight of arrows, they gave such horrible shouts and screeches, as though so many infernal hellhounds could not have made them more terrible. When they had spent their arrows, they joined together prettily, charging and retiring, every rank seconding another. As they got advantage, they catched their enemies by the hair of the head, and down he came that was taken. His enemy with his wood sword seemed to beat out his brains, and still they kept to the rear to maintain the skirmish. So they maintained order, shot arrows and dodged them, and once they were out of arrows, and with a clever formation to allow everyone to shoot, they would charge in, grapple the enemy, snap him down, smash him. That is such a cool mental image. Now obviously, European guns would start changing some things. Champlain, an early French explorer, wrote, "I marched on until I was within some 30 yards of the enemy, who as soon as they caught sight of me, halted and gazed at me, and I at them. When I saw them make a move to draw their bow upon us, I took aim with my arquebus and shot straight at one of the 3 chiefs, and with this shot 2 fell to the ground, and one of their companions was wounded, who died thereof a little later. I put 4 bullets into my arquebus. As soon as our people saw this shot so favorable for them, they began to shout so loudly that one could not have heard it thunder. Meanwhile, the arrows flew thick on both sides. The Iroquois were much astonished that 2 men should have been killed so quickly, although they were provided with shields made of cotton thread woven together in wood, which were proof against their arrows. This frightened them greatly. As I was reloading my arquebus, one of my companions fired a shot from within the woods, which astonished them, again so much that, seeing their chiefs dead, they lost courage and took flight, abandoning the field and their fort, and fleeing into the depth of the forest, whither I pursued them and laid low still more of them. Our Indians also killed several, and took 10 or 12 prisoners. The remainder fled with the wounded. Of our Indians, 15 or 16 were wounded with arrows, but these were quickly healed. Champlain, aiding the Wyandot or Huron versus the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois. Obviously, these guns would radically change some of the military tech used by Native American warriors. They abandoned their wooden shields and armors, and some of them even abandoned their bows and arrows and completely switched over to muskets. In Massachusetts, they even started learning how to repair the muskets, make flints, and cast their own shot. However, the musket barrels and the muskets as a whole, they often had to trade for. And so while they did get more powerful weapons from trading with the Europeans, they became more and more reliant on the Europeans for access to these guns, steel weapons, tools, and other implements. So, you get access to some great technology, but now you're more and more beholden to and a part of European socioeconomics. So, in Europe, you had these royal dynasties with their kingdoms and their estates. They marshaled their resources and large numbers of men to fight their wars of conquest for profit, for influence. They had or attempted to have autocratic levels of authority, bolstered by religious fervor, ethnic hatreds, greed. When they showed up in the Americas, as Jared Diamond puts it, they showed up with guns, germs, and steel. And yet, although the European diseases would kill off about 90% of all Native Americans, we're not even talking about combat, we're not even talking about slavery, we're not talking about famine, we're just talking about 90%. 9 out of 10 people are dying of some mysterious disease, right? That's some crazy epidemic type stuff. And although 90% of them died of disease, the surviving peoples, despite being decimated, despite, yes, being victims of colonization, imperialism, marginalization, slavery, warfare, they adapted and they courageously waged war in return. They dug into their hunter-warrior ethos and spirit. They utilized or worked within their methodology. They adopted military tech of the newcomers, of the aliens, and they fought like hell. When I look upon this history and its leaders and its warriors, I don't see people who are overcome with fear and despair, although I'm sure there were those people, and I'm sure there were those people sitting around becoming alcoholics and being depressed, but I see people that did not wish to sit around being victims, but rather people who took the initiative, used their human agency, overcame fear, and bravely fought for what they believed would be the best chance of survival for their people. And it is this story that inspires me so much. And if we could all take some of that into how we do everything in our lives, I think we'll all have better lives. As always, thank you for joining me on my journey. I salute yours. Peace.